Hello world, my name is Nate. You are watching an episode from Improving Space, issue number 1. This episode is from the cluster that you see, I'm doing that right, on my left, and it is called Diagrammin. Diagrammin because diagrammin is casual, and that's why we are using the slang, what the cool kids use when they say diagrammin, you know? So the light bulb went off to me with Diagrammin. And with the utility of diagrams, really, one day when I was working at a contractor. So I'm going to begin with this little story to just show you that there is some usefulness to all of this. So I was working with a contractor. I was kind of new to the job, and I had given them a budget. We were trying to make quotes apples to apples. So we had different bidders from, I think it was plumbers, something like that. And some included the materials, others didn't. Some substituted the toilets for different ones. Some included connections, others didn't. Whatever it was, there was a lot of different things going on, and we needed to get apples to apples. So I had provided my boss with the calculations that I had dutifully done to get there. So I showed in my calculations that I was subtracting this, adding that, and the final numbers were apples to apples. And he said, I don't know what I'm looking at. It was a very stressful time for me. I'm not going to do it justice because I don't want to stress you out. But he gave me some pretty firm feedback on the fact that he had no idea what he was looking at. And it was interesting because coming from an architectural background, I ought to have valued the things that he was looking for. And what he was looking for, as he described it, was my clicker's not working. What he was looking for was a lineup, as he described it. He said, I want to be able to see these three bids and understand what that apples to apples number is. All he was really looking for was to know where on the page he needed to go to get the information that he needed, which was the total. So he was really just talking about organizing the page in such a way as to give him that information. And so that's all we're going to be doing, but I do want to point out that once he was given that information, that man was able to meet. He could meet at a meeting for hours, and given the right information and the right framework, it became evident how much data and how much processing you can do if you're not wasting time trying to pick through the data to find the relevant stuff. If you've had somebody to prepare it for you, you can actually do a lot more in a 2 or 3 hour meeting than other people can if you have the right preparation, the right materials, and have kind of a friction-free ability to parse through everything. So that's why we're going to be talking about this. The prerequisite to being able to do these diagrams that I'm going to talk about is, quote, very simple, and I covered it in the video on pictures. But basically, the prerequisite is that you need to be able to draw a picture of a star that is good enough that when you look at it, you think that's a star, and not, oh my God, I can't draw a star to save my life and I hate myself. So you need to just be able to get over your own discomfort with your quality of illustration. And once you do that, you are off to the races as far as diagramming is concerned. So now we're going to talk about diagramming and the most powerful element of the diagram, which is the field. So the field, as we normally understand it, is a piece of paper, but the field could, for example, be an online environment. And we're going to be talking about it as the piece of paper in our example, but I encourage you to think of how this could one day evolve into an online environment and into a way of understanding our online world, essentially. So, talk about the field really quickly, and there's kind of 3 different types of fields that are commonly represented by a piece of paper. So the first type is space. Very common for a piece of paper or for the field to represent space as in a map. It could be a realistic map, or it could be a more diagrammatic map, say the New York City subway map. Regardless, the space is what that diagram is representing with the field. Another common representational medium or field is time. So calendars, storyboards, timelines, Gantt charts are all examples of that field, basically generally left to right, representing the flow of time. The last type of field that is commonly represented in diagrams is a conceptual field. So my example of this is a bubble diagram, and we're probably familiar with bubble diagrams. The problem with a bubble diagram is that the field of the diagram is generally not defined. A bubble diagram proceeds by starting with the center bubble and then looking for things that relate to it. So it is building itself and aggregating and basically defining the field as it moves out. And in practical terms, the field of the bubble diagram is essentially null. It is just they're waiting for more bubbles, and the bubble can kind of come out in whatever direction and via whatever associations they themselves have. So the field isn't actually like pulling anything out, and I'll explain what I mean by that right now. So if you try and look at the field of time, you see that these three types of fields or types of things that are being represented by the field kind of exist on a spectrum if you look at it. The space-based field represented by that globe is very concrete, whereas the conceptual field on the right-hand side of your image is very it's a very abstract and, like I said, poorly defined field because it's not actually the paper doesn't mean anything until bubbles start showing up. So if you look at time and where time sits in between those two types of fields, on first glance it does seem to be kind of in between. It's kind of concrete, but kind of not. But when you look at it closely, you see that taking the present moment, anything in the past is essentially pretty close to space in that it's already happened. It has a concreteness to it that we can agree on. Whereas the future is actually quite similar to conceptual space in that we don't know what major events are going to happen and when. We can depend on cyclical events like seasons and things like that, but we fundamentally don't know the future any more than we know a concept or a conceptual framework of something before we've studied it. So in that way, the past and space provides us with a field that people can understand what should be in there. You're missing World War II in your timeline. Whereas things in the future and in the conceptual field they're talking about a world that we don't have very many common points of reference in. And that is the kind of difference between trying to diagram concepts and diagram the future and trying to diagram the past and diagram space. It is much more evident what should be in a spatial or a timeline-based diagram than in a conceptual one or kind of a framework of the future events as they are going to unfold. So the point then that I'm going to be advocating for is to use more concrete fields such as place, time, proximity to different people coming in and out, like situational, concrete situational things, and use that as a framework to map out the space that you're trying to talk about when you go mining in the future and in the world of concepts. So now I'm going to get to an example. I'm going to take a quick break, and then I will get to an example of how to create a conceptual field using those more concrete frameworks. So let's talk about how to create a field or create a conceptual diagram where the page or the field actually means things that we can search and insert into those different places like we would in a map or a calendar or other like fixed temporal diagram or other fixed field diagram. So we're going to be using as an example soccer, or as the rest of the world calls it, football. And I chose this as an example, not that I don't frankly know very much about soccer. I know some of it. I've been to a couple of pro games. But conveniently, I do seem to know more than most of the people around me just from having a passing familiarity with it and having a friend who was in a traveling league as a kid. So I'm going to use this as an example, and I ask that viewers look past my maybe fundamental blind spots in the game of soccer, but we're all trying to just get on the same page about how we would describe something as we're kind of trying to figure out what's important and how we would describe it. So I'm going to use then, because I talked about, let's imagine that we're going to explain the game of soccer to a junior, like a peewee league that we have haplessly agreed to coach. So we want to figure out how we're going to teach soccer, and say, in my example, I know next to nothing, and I'm going to teach people who know literally nothing about it. So we're going to choose then, like, how do we start? Where do you start in explaining the game of soccer? So I'm going to propose that you would choose a space. Start by applying spatial a spatial field. And so the first space that comes to mind when you think of soccer is the soccer field. So what I would then encourage you to do is think of the field on one hand and then off the field on the other. So we're going to start our diagram just thinking, okay, let's start by organizing what happens on the field and what happens off the field. And we'll start with the off the field part, again, to look for things where we don't have obvious answers already. So we're just trying to build up our framework for understanding how we're going to coach soccer and explain the game. So off the field then, to spur you into, again, categories that you can look for and fill, let's propose some other categories, such as you could think of what can I teach about off the field soccer that you can do by yourself versus what you need other people to do. What can you do inside versus outside? So by giving yourself those situations, you can start to fill in. Oh yeah, you can read books in this context. You can, like, you need to exercise for soccer, and you can do that by yourself, but you need to generally be outside, or you can do it in a gym, so you need a gym. So you can start thinking of those things purely through the situations that you've put in front of yourself and said, what is it about this and soccer? Then you might move on to the field, so of the soccer field. In moving on to thinking about the soccer field, then after you've kind of looked through your list of things that happen off the field, you might start with the soccer field position players, and I've outlined them as I have. It's a 3-2-2-3 organization. Those things can move around. Those figures are not actually fixed positions in a soccer game as they are in a game of American baseball. So in looking at that, in proposing that first tier organization of a field, and we've got the position players, looking at that commitment helps you make judgments about whether or not that really is the relevant information. So you might look at those position players and then say, this is kind of going off on a track that isn't really relevant, because we're getting into positions and what are the more fundamental things that we would steer it in a direction where we want to be more legible to people. So you can start to look at the positions and then start to ask what's underneath that is more fundamental and that I should be teaching first. So by looking at these different areas, we essentially start to challenge ourselves for a brainstorming list of what we want to talk about, what's important to talk about in each of those scenarios. And I would argue that just showing yourself those scenarios and asking how am I going to approach this, both telling kids what to do at home, also on the field, how am I going to approach this, actually helps you build out a pretty good list to be able to work into. The way that it's working is by looking at the field, by looking at what's happening out of the field. You are giving your mind something to look at and something to make judgments on, something to find what's important and pass over what's not important. So we're doing what we talked about in the pictures video, which is providing ourselves with an overall image and being able to scan that image, that field in our head, to basically scan our own minds for meaning and importance by using a framework that we can look around in. So as an example, the final diagram that I might have created out of looking at these spatial and situational categories might go something like this. So say you're a coach and you kind of get off to one side of the paper, all the things that you need the kids to be doing outside of coaching and practice time. So they need to be eating right, exercising, reading up on books, practicing, getting ready, getting their uniforms washed, signing up. So all the stuff that the coach can't think about or doesn't want to be responsible for would go in that section of off the field things. You then have a kind of an on the field category, and as I was thinking of it, I'm like, okay, there's on the field during a game. So there's the kind of field during a game and what is actually happening there. If I was going to be teaching it at an entry level to a bunch of kids, I probably wouldn't talk about position players. I would probably talk about concepts like defensive concepts, having which I've represented with a wall there, like how do you form a good defensive barrier, the idea of getting open and getting space around you, being able to shoot a ball on target, whether towards a goal or towards your teammate. So you kind of are breaking down, for looking at that field and then that soccer field and figuring out what are the dynamics of that thing, how does that soccer field change, and how do you pull out the stable parts from that landscape. Finally, in looking at preparing kids for playing the game of soccer, you might then have a third category, which is things that the coach can do. It's not up to the soccer player's time, it's things that the coach can do, but outside of a game. So we might call it practice. So what are the skills that we've got? Three situations. We've got things that happen off the field, things that happen during a soccer game, and then practice things to go over. So by giving yourself that kind of spatial, and it's really temporal, like with or without a certain person, you give yourself a framework to then explore and populate. Now, you might be saying, how do you possibly kind of glaze over a couple of important details, such as like the offsides rule or corner kicks, or the fact that you can't use your hands in your explanation of soccer to these poor kids who are going to be introduced to it through you? And what I would say to that is that all of those higher level things, like a corner kick or the offsides rule, you've given yourself, through this framework of a diagram, you've given yourself a place to put those things. So you can talk about practicing the offsides rule, and then you can actually talk about how the field with soccer players on it is influenced by that line that goes down with the last defensive player or the soccer ball. So you've given yourself a place to put all of those ideas instead of just starting with a couple of rules and kind of starting from scratch to build the thing. You've actually identified what can be done, where, how, and when, and that those limitations actually give you a good field to work with. So beyond that, I've showed you kind of a bunch of not great drawings. So beyond that, how do you build up the diagram and make it something professional and worth sharing in an office context? A lot of that comes down to simple things. I'll call them simple, although it is an art to mastering them. Things like line weights, and not kind of badly drawn line weights like you see there, but hard line, as we used to call them, lines, straight lines, varying line weights. Simple things like that, bringing things into order, making sure that things aren't vying for people's attention, but rather creating a legible field that you can scan all over the various areas, are kind of the key to making a good diagram. But I will propose that we can, I'm going to leave off the idea of developing the diagram into something good looking, because not only is that more of a professional thing that there are books and things to be able to study, but the way that the world is going, it does seem like the ability to hone something in, make it look picture perfect, and make it glossy and ready to be posted online, that to me is something that you can no longer depend on that polish as a sign that this thing has been thought through. To me, the push that I'm trying to push for is to be able to get people thinking and talking without worrying about whether or not it looks great. Trusting that something on the back end can take care of an idea that actually is determined to be good. So if by some miracle this turned into the greatest way to explain soccer that in the history of the world, then we would brush it up a little bit, you know. But for now, I'm just putting the idea out there, and for that reason, I encourage you to think about you could explore diagramming for years before actually trying to make something hardline on a computer that is ready to be published. You could be thinking of your own thoughts for years before you've got something that's ready to go out there. I've only got a couple of hard lines in this, just with the borders and things like that. So that is the end of this presentation. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it's given you a couple of things to think about. The other episodes in issue 1, one of them is on 6 documents, so it's a bit veering into the construction and design coordination territory. But 6 documents does describe you creating a new field, essentially, to be able to organize construction information. And in the follow-up to that, a file evolves. I discuss being able to break this open into more of a computing world, and how you can think about these things like fields, how you can create them on your own, and then establish them for other people, so we can all kind of pile on and start sharing our thoughts to that field of importance that you've created for people. The final video in issue 1 is called New Ideas for Old Problems, and that is where I will be packing up all of these ideas into a kind of plan and offer a proposal to the American public for being able to communicate and coordinate and try and lasso this democracy that we've got into something that is more approaches what we would all agree is a rational approach to a government. This has been a Dent and Pencil production. All of these images that you see are free to use. They are hereby released under the Creative Cloud, CC BY, whatever. The rest of this is copyrighted, but I do encourage and would love to see people sharing these ideas. So as long as you are citing the work, I think that I've set it up so that you can share these things and you can talk about this thing a little bit easier than you can other books. Thank you very much. I hope to see you, or I won't see you, but I hope that you see me in the next episode. Take care. Bye.